This is Heather Kelly. I'm a field crops plant pathologist and IPM coordinator for University of Tennessee. Today I'm going to be talking about disease management decisions, but with a fungicide focus. So when thinking about diseases, there are four main factors that fall into what we call the disease pyramid. And these factors are what is needed for a disease to become a pest. And essentially what I mean by that is for it to cause yield loss, for it to be an issue in your field and you need to take action, right? So the first thing, and you can use PEST as the acronym to remember these four factors. So first you have to have the pathogen present. This is influenced by your field history, cover crops, as well as getting your soil sample to know what pathogens, such as nematodes, you might have in your field. Next, you need the right environment. The right environment to not only allow infection, but for then to disease develop. And while we can't control the environment, we can influence things like planting date, planting density, that then ultimately also still can affect disease development. And as well as the microclimate that develops later in the season within that plant, within that planting. You also have to have a susceptible host. So know your cultivar. Your variety and hybrid selection are very important. It doesn't mean you have to go with one that has the best disease package. A lot of times there are really high yielding cultivars out there, but they do have some chinks in their armor when it comes to their disease package. And just knowing that going into the season, you'll know what to be scouting for and you'll have a plan to address it if you do end up having disease be an issue. So lastly, though, you also have to consider time. It's only when the previous three factors all occur at a critical time or growth stage within your crop that then that disease has the capability for potential yield loss and an action needs to be taken. And in this case, and for this presentation, we're talking about foliar fungicides. I also like to always go over all the resources available to you through the field crops specialists. And so with that, I break them out over when we talk about when disease is a pest to help you identify the pathogens you might have, the diseases that develop in your fields. We do have field guides that are mobile friendly at the guide.utcrops.com website. Our home base site, which is really the main resource you can remember, utcrops.com, has many publications, fact sheets, agronomic sheets to help you find what is the best planting window, seeding rate for the crop. And then also our variety database, search.utcrops.com. Still use your company information for your cultivars and hybrids, but you can always look to see if University of Tennessee has looked at it and the information we have gathered from it in our area in Tennessee and what you might expect, particularly for soybean and just more recently corn. I look at our CST varieties or hybrids with and without a fungicide and report that yield difference in our database there. And then lastly, we do have news.utcrops.com as well as a Remind app. And with that, that's where you can subscribe to our weekly email or just visit us there to look at our blog during the season. This is where we post information in real time to let you know what we're hearing about, what we're seeing about in the field, and to be mindful of what actions you could be taking. And this is across all management areas and really incorporating all of the integrated pest management that has to be done to efficiently and effectively grow your crops. The one other resource that's more disease specific that I want to mention is Crop Protection Network. This site has a lot of good webinars and videos, some that I've contributed to. Specifically, there's Intro to Scouting for Diseases, Scouting for Soybean Diseases. Particularly the Crop Protection Network covers soybean, corn, cotton, and wheat, with cotton being the newest one just to have come on board. And so again, know the resources out there to help you, again, identify diseases and understand how to scout for them. So getting into soybean. So soybean, we have many things that can affect soybean, both above ground and below ground. And again, it's important to identify what you have. Here on the left, you have our foliar diseases: frog eye leaf spot, target spot, septoria brown spot, as well as downy mildew. But in particular, only the three, frog eye leaf spot, target spot, and septoria brown spot, can actually potentially cause yield loss. Where downy mildew, you might see it, but it actually is not needed a fungicide to control it. You won't see a response in your yield. It would be a waste of a foliar fungicide if all you're trying to do is control downy mildew. Similarly, the diseases, the soil-borne diseases on the right side of the screen, while they are all from the soil, they can cause above ground symptoms that look very similar and could be mistaken for a foliar disease. But no, none of the diseases on the right will respond to a foliar fungicide. And again, you would be wasting your money, wasting that application, because you won't be controlling what's actually causing the issues in your field. So again, clearly identify the disease, the causal, the pathogen that's causing the disease, so you know the right measures to take. So once you have identified that you might need a fungicide, what are some other things you need to be thinking about? So first is, what is the growth stage? So again, based on data not only from Tennessee, but across soybean production area in the US, we found that really fungicides are really only beneficial during the reproductive growth stages, particularly that beginning bloom, which is R1, to beginning pod, R3. And so R3 is when in the top 4 nodes, you have at least about a 1/4 inch of a pod developing. Before or after this time period, you reduce the probability of a rate of investment or a rate of return for that fungicide. Also, what is your variety? Again, utilize the resources available to you from the company, as well as you can use search.utcrops.com to look up for potential yield response and disease susceptibility to a fungicide. I look at, again, the varieties that are nominated for our county standardized tests, our CSTs, with and without a fungicide at anywhere from 2 to 3 locations on a yearly basis. And that gives you, and I report all those results again at our database. So you can look up if the variety you're planting we've looked at, maybe even across multiple years, you can have multiple data points to help you assess what the potential yield impact would be from a fungicide on that variety under different disease pressure situations. And then, of course, it still always goes back to, are you seeing a disease present? And what is the susceptibility of your variety, right? So again, we have guide.utcrops.com, as well as other resources to you, including your local county agent. That's really one of the best resources you have. Make sure you know them and you involve them when you can in your production practices. They know best what resources might be best utilized by your production and be able to aid you in your decisions for your management decisions. So again, if you have decided you found a foliar disease that will respond to a fungicide, which fungicide to use? There are fungicide efficacy use tables, both at utcrops.com, but also at the Crop Protection Network. You can find both very good fungicide efficacy tables there. And I'm going to circle back around to really the highest probability of at least breaking in, even on using a foliar fungicide, is you need to make sure you're using 2 modes of action in that fungicide. And I'll cover what that means a little bit later. Also, here in Tennessee, we have soybean scout schools every year in July. We announce those dates and those locations at our blog site once they are set up. We also have our soybean disease and insect field day, which is always held the 2nd week in September at the Milan Research and Education Center. And again, the specific date and time of that is announced at news.utcrops.com. So I want to show you a little data here to illustrate also when I see a significant response to a fungicide due to disease, it goes hand in hand with fields that have higher yield potential. And so this is data from 3 different locations across 3 different years. The bars are our yield in bushels per acre, and the gray lines are our frog eye leaf spot disease severity. So each location, as our yield increases, we usually also have increased in disease, or inversely, when we have decreased yield, we also see usually less disease. The same environment that the soybean thrives in, the disease also thrive in. And so then analyzing across these 8 different sites, what we call site years, we had 3 site years where we only had a variety response when it came to what impacted our yield. And I should mention, in the CSTs, we have anywhere from 60 varieties, upwards of 80, that span from maturity group 3 through 4 and 5. And this is summarizing across all that data, across, again, this 3-year data set and 3 locations, Jackson, Milan, and then 1 location that was double planted wheat beans. In addition to these 3 site years, we also had 3 additional site years that also we saw variety impact influence our yield, but also at these 3 locations where the orange boxes are, we also had fungicide significantly increase our yield or protect our yield. And what you'll notice is these are our higher potential or high yielding sites, as well as matched with higher disease. And so again, that's when you're going to have your best probability of breaking even or getting a return on your investment. When it comes to a foliar fungicide in soybean, this was Tennessee data. Now looking at a much larger data set that spans some data from Tennessee, but across these 8 different states, across 10 cropping seasons or 10 years, total of 66 field trials. And what they were looking at was our frog eye leaf spot severity as well as soybean yield. So with that, in this graph, you have on the left-hand axis, the vertical axis, your yield response to each of the fungicides listed, as well as the percent efficacy. That's how well it controlled frog eye leaf spot. So here you have what we call kind of our most effective group, had about 55% efficacy. And so that's a point to make too. Even our best fungicides, we don't get 100% control of our leaf spot diseases or our foliar diseases. Usually anywhere from 50 to 70% efficacy is the best we can hope for, and that does the job. So with that group, so the products listed in the legend there that are in blue go along with this grouping here. They had an efficacy about 55% and about 5.2 bushel per acre response. Here we have our next 2 products, and what you'll notice is these all have mixed modes of action with the exception of Topsin, which is an MVC product. Our intermediate group, we have Domark and Preaxar plus Tilt. Again, efficacy was 40 to 45% with a 4.5 bushel per acre response. And then here on the left in the bottom corner, less than 11% efficacy and less than 2 bushel per acre response. This is Headline. Similarly, a Quadris, essentially, or a generic azoxystrobin product would also fall right on top of this. And so that would be a number 11 when you look at your fungicide group on your label. So we do not recommend you go with a fungicide that only has an 11 QOI or strobilurin in the tank. You will be essentially losing money because of this. And this is due to fungicide resistance in this pathogen. But this same fungicide resistance has also been identified in our other 2 major foliar pathogens in soybean, being target spot and Septoria brown spot. So that data was further analyzed in just a different way, looking at the probability of recovering the costs of a fungicide and its application. And so again, overall, you still have a pretty high probability of recovering costs in soybean compared to the rest of our field crops that we'll discuss. But looking at Mervis top, which is our mixed mode of action, and high disease is when we have our highest probability of recovering our costs, followed by tetraconazole or Domark, a single mode of action, but not the number 11. Triazole is a number 3. It has moderate probability of recovering costs, but again, only in that high disease pressure versus, again, the solo product that's a QOI or a strobilurin, a number 11, here being Headline. No matter your disease pressure, you have a low probability of recovering your costs And really across the board, when you have low disease, you have a low probability of recovering your costs. So again, as soybeans reach that reproductive growth stages, they start to bloom is when you want to start scouting them to see if you actually have any disease out there that would warrant a fungicide application. Switching gears now to wheat and wheat fungicide decisions. Here on utcrops.com, under the wheat section and disease section, you'll find the wheat foliar fungicide point system. This is something that was modified from my predecessor, Dr. Melvin Newman. And you can go through these questions here, answering 1, 2, or 3, which then correlate to a point system. Based on your total number of points after answering the questions, your chance of essentially a yield response, based on my predecessor's data, you have excellent, fair, or poor. And so with that, though, if you do find that you are in the excellent category, the timings you're looking at a foliar fungicide are either at flag leaf or beginning bloom. And that's because of again, the diseases you would be targeting with your foliar fungicide application. So early on, you might see powdery mildew, but this is very variety dependent. And I usually only see this be problematic where it is very, very thick, where the planting rate was probably higher than it needed to be. And you get this white fuzzy growth. Versus leaf and gloom blotch. You see this across most all varieties, but the severity of it varies. And then also we have our rusts. These have to blow up from the south each year. So again, that news.utcrops.com, if you get plugged in there, we'll let you know where you can scout or where you can find online scouting information where they've seen this further south of us and how it might be moving closer to us. But if you're at flag leaf and you're not seeing any disease, then my recommendation is to wait until beginning bloom. And at that point in time, leading up to that time, you can use this predictive modeling tool for fusarium head blight or head scab at wheatscab.psu.edu. Here, again, if we're in low risk, you would not need to necessarily put out a fungicide during that beginning bloom. But if you're at a moderate or higher risk, you might want to consider that because later in the season, when you actually see the symptoms and signs of fusarium head blight, there's nothing you can do. The damage is already being done to the heads, as well as there could be a mycotoxin issue that develops where this fungus produces a mycotoxin that could potentially further dock the grain. So now moving on to corn. Corn is the least responsive to a foliar fungicide. Essentially, you have the least probability of a return on your investment for a foliar fungicide in corn. Less than half the time I see a yield response with a fungicide, but again, if you're going to see it, it would be where a fungicide would be applied at tasseling to that brown silk stage. And again, the majority, if not all of my data really is from a high disease pressure area where I'm looking at a highly susceptible variety or a highly susceptible hybrid to gray leaf spot pictured in the upper right-hand corner. And it's with that essentially very volatile environment, again, it's half the time or less that I actually see a yield response from a foliar fungicide. And so really if it was as if it had the higher probabilities, say similar to soybean, I would see much more yield response in my trial work, which I do not. But again, we are in the last few years developing a similar database for corn hybrids as I have for soybean varieties, where the hybrids that are submitted to our county standardized trials, our CSTs, I'm looking at in large plot or strips, as well as small randomized replicated plots with and without a foliar fungicide. And again, publishing that information on our search.utcrops.com database. Again, making sure you identify specifically what you're looking at. And our area, our biggest contributors to fungicide response are gray leaf spot, as well as southern rust. So I'm also seeing some diploidea leaf streak more often in the past few years, but again, I do not see response to a fungicide when it comes to impacting its yield. on this foliar pathogen here. But on the horizon, we do want to be on the lookout for tar spot. This disease was first observed in Tennessee, but right on the Kentucky line in central Tennessee in 2021. But since then, I have not been able to find it in the state. And so it might not become established and might not be a regular issue we have to deal with. But essentially, we have our gray leaf spot and our southern rust, again, has to move up from the south to be a potential impact on yield, versus tar spot could be a potential impact on yield. But essentially, it's these three that we know do provide a response to a foliar fungicide for protecting our yield. Looking at our first year, essentially 2024 data from those CST hybrids trials, looking at with and without a fungicide. So in general, across this data set, site where we did the trial really impacted our yield response in 2024, where we did have, starting on the right-hand side in Jackson, dry land, and we went through a drought of almost 60 days straight, starting the last day of July, going through August. And so yield was highly impacted here in Jackson. We also had a dry land site, though, in Milan that did catch more rain. We did have small plot in Milan that was irrigated, but you can tell it really didn't get the irrigation it needed to maximize yield, versus, again, at WT Rec, where we had large strips, we had irrigation, we had our best yield across our locations. Now, to further, though, really dive into how fungicide may have affected a yield response, the data was analyzed and grouped by maturity, meaning early, mid, or full maturity. So looking at early maturing hybrids, we saw no response to a fungicide, not statistically nor numerically. Looking at the mid-maturity hybrids, regardless of site, we did see an average 7 bushel per acre response in yield. And similarly, if we analyze that same data set, but instead of just looking at bushels per acre, but look at the yield percent difference, it did show that irrigated sites were those that actually were driving this fungicide response. And so particularly here, where we have our large irrigated strips in Jackson at the research center, as well as our small irrigated plots in Milan, that's where we had the higher percent yield response to a foliar fungicide, from 5.1 to 6.5%, versus none on our dry land. And again, looking at just our small plot data, only our irrigated location here in Milan had an average fungicide response of 10 bushels per acre, and that's across all the mid-maturity hybrids. So then lastly, looking at the full hybrids, fungicide was very dependent upon site, and essentially only here at our large, it was our large strip trial here at the West Tennessee Research and Education Center, where we saw this significant interaction where fungicide increased yield or protected yield. The problem with this site is, instead of being able to make the trial wide, where we could do 8 rows of each hybrid and go anywhere from 150 to 300 feet long and treat 4 rows and have 4 rows untreated, we had a longer, skinnier area and we couldn't go that wide. And so we only had 4 rows of each hybrid, and we had to cut the field in half and apply fungicide on one half of the field than the other. And I can tell you, we applied the fungicide on the higher yielding potential field, or the higher half of the field that had higher yield potential. So I really don't trust that data. I think it's an artifact of the field and how the trial was laid out. One is more representative of what I have confidence in is the 3 other locations where we did not see a significant statistical difference with the fungicide across our late or our full hybrids. So our takeaways from our corn CST investigating fungicide response. If I was asked, what is the best placement of fungicide for corn, outside of making sure you're scouting and you know your disease package in your hybrid, the mid-maturity groups from this first year of data and under irrigation would be the best placement if you were going to put fungicide out on corn. and you might expect about a 5% yield increase. So plugging that into what your average yields are to certain high production fields under irrigation, and what your fungicide as well as application costs would be if you're applying it through an aerial applicator, would that actually break even or even give you a return on your investment? And a lot of times it will fall short, depending on the prices for corn in the year. But each year at each location significantly influences yield as well as your response to your fungicide, because it really relates back to disease development. So it was interesting that hybrid was not significant when it came to yield, nor was there any interaction with hybrid with fungicide. Again, in this 1 year of data across 4 different sites. And so we hope to continue this work with the support of the Corn Promotion Board, Tennessee Corn Promotion Board funding. So jumping into our last crop is our cotton. And here I'm just going to talk about initially where cotton diseases can attack the plant. Similarly to our other crops, we have below ground and above ground pests, diseases that can affect our bottom line, our yield. And here, again, from Crop Protection Network, where we, plant pathologists across the US, publish our estimated disease loss annual summary. I made a graph from 2015 through 2022 at the percent loss across the cotton belt, looking at nematodes, seedling diseases, target spot, which also includes other leaf spots, and bacterial blight. And while these do contribute to yield loss, you can see our greatest potential yield loss, or our yield robber, are our nematodes in cotton. What is below ground, what you cannot see. And so with that, you really need to know your nematodes. Get your soil tested, and when possible, rotate to a non-host. That is the best management practice when you're dealing with nematodes, is if you can rotate to a crop that is a non-host to that nematode, it brings the density, the overall population level down in the field. So the next time you do go back to that field with a susceptible host, say cotton, you do also have options for nematode-resistant cultivars. Or in years you can't rotate, you can look at nematode-resistant cultivars. There are also seed treatments and in-furrow applications, but their window of efficacy is very short. They only have effects usually on that first generation of a nematode population, if that. And for the most part, you can have anywhere from 3 to 6 generations of nematodes occur in Tennessee. But switching gears now to cotton and fungicide decisions in cotton. Well, so even though, going back to that previous slide, we do have a lot of above ground diseases that can affect and show foliar or above ground issues, there's only 2 diseases that actually could warrant a foliar fungicide, and that is target spot and areolet mildew. So to help you identify these 2 diseases from our other cotton foliar diseases, Cotton Incorporated supported a publication on diagnosis and management of foliar diseases. With that, you can find that on utcrops.com, but then I also took it and made it into more of an interactive guide on our mobile-friendly field site, guide.utcrops.com. And this is a screenshot of it over here. And again, there'll be images and descriptions of seedling diseases, and essentially, again, click on that key to differentiating spots to help you better understand what you might be looking at in your field. By the end of the season every year, there is going to be some leaf spot complex, which can be Stemphylium leaf spot, Cercospora leaf blight, or even Alternaria leaf spot. But none of these really ever will require a foliar fungicide, because even though it could clean up your canopy, your yield will not be affected. The majority of those are there because they are opportunistic pathogens, and they're there because the crop is stressed, a lot of times due to potential nutrient deficiency, most often potassium. But usually by the end of the season, the crop is spent anyways, and it's not going to be that big of a yield. impact. It mainly just shows you really have a lot of bolls out there that are ready to be harvested. But again, other things that we have had bacterial blight look a lot like target spot in the past, as well as areolet mildew is new to our area. And so again, use those tools available for you. So areolet mildew, also called Remularia leaf spot, has been confirmed across the Southeast and the Mid-South. In Tennessee, it was only first observed ever in 2022. Since then, we have observed it, usually only showing up in mid-August. The amount of disease we're seeing ranges anywhere from 1 to 20% incidence. That means only 1% of the plants, up to 20% of the plants, show some level of disease. And then also a 1 to 60% severity. And that means either 1% up to 60% of the leaf area is being affected by this disease. So far, after the 2024 season, I do not have any data to report that actually shows significant yield loss in Tennessee. But if our first observation of the disease moves up, say to mid-July, that could change very quickly. And this disease, you have angular spots on the leaf, but mainly this can also occur in the middle to lower canopy. And on the underside of the leaf usually is where it develops some white fuzzy growth. But to better understand, and so the other thing too is a better picture of some of that up close fuzzy growth, as well as older lesions then no longer produce that fuzzy white growth that is the fungus, but those areas die, they become necrotic and brown. So you can get these angular lesions also. And also the main thing is this defoliates, prematurely defoliates the cotton plant. Again, if it comes on early enough in the season. And with that, the leaves affected almost cup up claw, they almost look kind of like a cupped up claw, and then fall off the plant. And I've seen this happen quite quickly in certain years. And so it can develop very quickly. But to better understand and compare it to then target spot, again, looking at when is disease a pest. And so looking at these two foliar pathogens, foliar diseases in cotton. What's interesting here is where target spot, we just have one species of the fungus that causes it. For areolet mildew, there are two different species, Remulariopsis gossypii and then pseudoglycines. So the first report of areolet mildew in cotton is actually from 1890 out of Alabama. So it's very interesting that it's such an old disease, if you will, but only then in 2022 was the first observation and report we've ever seen it in Tennessee. Well, the newer species is the pseudoglycine species that showed up down in Brazil before we ever reported it in the US. And similarly, they found that between those two species, the pseudoglycine species is much more aggressive. And so in the US, it looks like that the pseudoglycine species also has a wider range in that it can actually come up further north into Tennessee cotton production area, likely comparative to the older species, Gossypii. Both of the pathogens that cause areolet mildew, as well as the one that causes target spot, their main survival is in the previous year's debris. So again, noting if you had either of these diseases the previous year, and then when you're going back to either the next season with cotton again, or even when you do rotate and you go back to those fields, keeping good records of what you saw will help you know what you should be scouting for the coming season. So far, where we do have continuous cotton and we've seen the areolet mildew, we do see it consecutive years in a row. So the environment is very similar for both of these pathogens to infect and then develop disease. They both like it wet and humid and hot, but the mildew really does tolerate heat more so than target spot. And then the biggest thing between the two, again, is where you might find it in the canopy. While target spot, you will first find it in the lower canopy only after canopy closure has occurred. The areolet mildew, we have seen it in high prevalence before the canopy ever closes. And again, while you might find it in the lower canopy first, you might also see it in the mid canopy first, and it gets in the upper canopy much more easily than target spot does. Both of them, though, again, their main mechanism for causing yield loss is defoliation, premature defoliation. of the cotton leaves. For susceptible hosts, all cultivars right now are susceptible to both of these diseases, but these are still being investigated. And even though they're all susceptible, they're not the same. There's varying levels of susceptibility to these diseases. And lastly, time. The earlier the disease develops, the greater chance of impacting yield. And really, this is the case with all diseases. But that, again, is not to say that environment, again, can't come in, or having a certain cultivar could change that, particularly in 2024. While we did see the disease come in some areas earlier than the previous year, because of those drought conditions we had, it didn't stop areolet mildew from developing, but it did slow its development, where in future years that might not be the case. And with good growing conditions and moisture, we might see it progress much more quickly. So if you have identified that you have one of these foliar diseases in your cotton, you're warranted to look at fungicides. Here I do want to mention, though, in cotton, we have found we do not need to spray these fungicides as a preventative, as we do with most other crops and most other diseases in those crops. Here, when we've looked at different fungicide timing regimens, as well as just doing an IPM application and waiting until you actually find the first sign of those diseases, we always have better control of the disease, as well as return on our investment when we wait to see the signs of the disease. So again, we've not seen yield loss due to areolet mildew in Tennessee. But if you have identified target spot or areolet mildew, you're at a growth stage where it could impact yield with the amount of defoliation that it could cause. We do have fungicides on the market that are labeled, some for both areolet mildew here in the table as AM and target spot as TS, and some that might only be labeled just for target spot. So our take-home points for cotton disease management: again, know what you have in your field, particularly for cotton. Soil sample for nematodes. When you are sampling for nematodes, it's best to sample in the fall. You can wait till after harvest, after the stalks have been chopped. You're mainly aiming to try to sample before the first freeze, but even after the first freeze, it's not a waste to try to sample. The same sample you pull could be divvied up to also do soil fertility analysis. The really only difference when you go to sample for nematodes, if you look in the image in the bottom right-hand corner, instead of taking your soil probe and going between the rows and going up and down, you want to only come off of your row 6 to 4 inches and then angle your probe at a 45-degree angle. So when you push it all the way in, you're sampling around the root zone of your previous crop. This is where the nematodes are going to be. The nematodes will not be in between the rows where there are no root systems. And so that's why some samples, we can't say for absolute certainty there are no nematodes. We can just say we did not detect them. So again, sampling closer to the row with a 45-degree angle with your probe gives us much better accuracy and confidence in the results that we get from that soil sample when we're looking for nematodes. Again, the highest population will be in the fall. Almost all nematodes, except reniform nematode, overwinter as eggs. And so in the spring, if you take a soil sample, really the only nematode that can truly accurately be screened for is the reniform nematode, because these are microscopic worms, as imaged here. And not only can you only see these worms under a microscope, but the only way you can tell which species they are is by looking at their mouth parts. And only then you can say which type of nematode it is. So hence why, again, only the adults of reniform overwinter and would still be there in the spring. Your threshold just are reduced for your spring sampling compared to your fall sampling. We do help process full soil samples for full pathogenic nematodes. Again, look at utcrops.com and you can search for nematodes, and you will find a publication on how to sample for nematodes, the form to fill out with your nematode sample to send it here to Jackson, and also how to pay for those if you want the full pathogenic screen. Switching gears back to soybean, where we do have soybean cyst nematode, due to the support of the Tennessee Soybean Promotion Board, we can process all soybean cyst nematode samples for free here in Jackson. And again, all that information is up at utcrops.com. Switching back to foliar diseases, make sure you're managing your growth. So the foliar diseases, again, they like it hot and humid, and more rank cotton, that microclimate in there is going to have more humidity. And so most of the time, not only can that increase your risks of some of these foliar diseases, but it increase your risk for boll rot. And really the only management for boll rot is really good growth management. There are no fungicides that will help with boll rot. And really also insect control is honestly your best management for boll rot, because it's either going to be too humid of a canopy that allows those infections to occur on your bolls, or also that insects have allowed a wound to occur on the boll that allows those pathogens easier access. Again, cultivar selection is critical, mostly for your nematode selections where you do have high nematode populations. Make sure you're trying to go with a cultivar. We do have true genes in there that do not allow the nematode to reproduce at the same level as a susceptible cultivar, which is very good. And again, use your management options when needed, right? We do have in-furrow applications over treatment by seed treatment, foliar fungicides, but again, only needed when you have a disease become a pest. Again, those four main factors when they come together to essentially threaten your yield. So our overall takeaway from this presentation, right? Use the resources available to you to help you make your management decisions, and make sure you're using the best integrated management practices out there. So we have utcrops.com that are very specific resources for Tennessee, as well as a crop protection network that really has great resources that can be utilized across the nation. Make sure you're identifying your pests. Again, that's what those resources are for. That's what your county agent is for, as well as the specialists that can come to you across the state to help you identify what you have, what's going on in your field. Know your variety or your hybrid. Again, you don't have to necessarily go with the variety that has the best disease package, but knowing where some of its weaknesses are can help you better plan for what you might have to address going into the season and protect that yield. Again, the highest yield potential you'll have is when you buy that bag of seed and before you ever put it in the ground. And then lastly, of course, consider a fungicide if warranted. Again, is disease a pest? Do you have the pathogen present? Do you have the right environment? Because if we're going into a drought, you do not have the right environment for a fungicide to be warranted. Do you have a susceptible host? Again, understand that variety hybrid response or potential response to a fungicide based on its susceptibility to foliar diseases. And then again, time. What growth stage are you at? And how much time is left in the season to make your crop, grain or your cotton, to get it picked and into the buggy. So with that, our data suggests obviously the location is very much an influencer of this, not just due to the different environments across locations, but we know different fields have different yield potentials. And so again, higher yield potential fields would be the areas that would have a higher probability of warranting a fungicide application. That would make the most sense, and again, have the higher probability of it at least breaking even, if not giving you a return on that investment. So with that, I always thank everyone for their attention. I love to throw up pictures of my kids. This is what I do outside of work. Again, I'm Heather Kelly with the University of Tennessee. Please feel free to reach out to me by email or phone if I can ever help you in any way with your production issues or disease management, integrated pest management decisions. Thank you very much for listening.